Thank you so much for joining us today. Over the next hour, we'll be briefing you on the latest immigration updates throughout the region as we continue to navigate the mobility challenges posed by COVID-19. By way of introduction, my name is Maria Hrambanis and I'm the Director of Immigration Services for APAC here at Sirva. I'm also an Australian Registered Migration Agent. Co-presenting with me today are my wonderful colleagues. We have Janaea Scalacci, who is a manager in our Australian immigration team and a registered migration agent. We have Carmen Choi, who is a manager in our Hong Kong immigration team. And we also have Masuri Omar, who is our immigration team lead in Singapore. Now, we each have over 10 years of experience in the immigration profession, so you are in very good hands today. Now, before we begin, we do have a legal disclaimer. So the information we are sharing today is current and accurate as of today. It is, however, subject to change in the future, and the information we are presenting today is of general information only. So it should not be considered as migration law advice and should not be relied upon because of its general nature. If you do need specific case advice, then please do reach out to the Sirva immigration team and we would be more than happy to assist you with your queries. In terms of any discussion of processing times today, any processing times that are discussed are approximate only and can of course vary. In terms of today's agenda, the locations we will be covering are Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and Malaysia. Now, throughout the presentation, there will be an opportunity for you to submit questions via the Q&A chat box. So as any questions arise, please submit them through the Q&A box, which you should see on your screen. And then at the end, we'll also answer some of the most common questions live. So we'll pick out some of the most common questions that are posed throughout. Now, just a brief overview of Sirva. We are a global leader in moving, relocation and immigration services. Our global footprint, combined with our cutting edge technology and in-house capabilities, which does include immigration services, means we can offer you an integrated moving and relocation solution. Now, before we start the country-specific updates, we wanted to take the opportunity to ask some poll questions. So we would love to get your input and hear about your experiences since we have such a wide audience today. So you should see the poll questions appearing on your screen and you'll have the ability to submit your answers. So the first question that we have is, how has your organization generally managed international assignments during the global pandemic? So we have three options. We've got new international assignments have been put on hold or cancelled. Second potential answer is reduced and limited to critical roles only. And then the last option is proceeding as per usual to the extent possible, of course, including in-country extensions and renewals. So please submit your answers. I can see the results jumping around from each of the potential options. So we'll keep the poll open for a few more seconds and we'll close it in 3, 2, 1. So we'll end the polling there and share with you the results. So interesting split. So we've got only 18% saying new international assignments have been put on hold or cancelled, and then an even split, 45% each, saying that assignments have been reduced to critical roles only. And then we've also got proceeding as per usual to the extent possible, including in-country extensions and renewals. And to be honest, these results are not unexpected. So, you know, in our experience, we have seen a number of assignment programs continuing to the extent possible, including managing in-country extensions and renewals. So assignees choosing to stay in country rather than repatriating. So interesting result. Thank you for sharing that. On to the next poll question. So the second poll question that we have is, what is your greatest mobility challenge in 2021, or what do you foresee will be your greatest mobility challenge in 2021? So options are borders remaining closed, cost, desire of assignees to go on assignment, visa compliance, which to be honest is a challenge regardless if we're in a global pandemic or not. And then lastly, enhanced regulations and enhanced criteria. So for example, increased labour market testing requirements. So if you'd like to submit your answers, we'll keep the poll open for a few more moments. We'll then close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And locking those answers in. So by far the majority of you have voted that borders remaining closed will remain the greatest mobility challenge in 2021, which is not a surprise once again. So we were expecting that to be the answer, and it has turned out to be the answer. So as we go through the presentation in each location, we'll touch on what the current border restrictions are and what the process is for entry approvals, if that is allowed in the particular location. And then moving on to the final question. So we just touched on entry approvals or travel exemptions, depending on what location you're in and what it's called. But where your organisation has been successful in obtaining an entry approval or travel exemption where it's required. So for example, countries like Singapore, Malaysia or Australia, how many times did you have to apply to obtain that entry approval? So the options we have are approved first time, up to 3 applications, up to 5 applications, and then we also have 5 or more applications. So if you'd like to submit your answers, we'll keep the poll open for a few more moments. And we will close the poll in 3, 2, 1. So locking in those results, we have the majority of you saying that your travel approval was approved the first time. So I'm guessing those of you who have said it was approved the first time are Sirva clients. We've submitted a number of entry approvals and travel exemptions across various locations and have had a high rate of success, which has been excellent to see. And then we do have a proportion saying up to 3 applications were required, and another small proportion who are saying that 5 or more applications were required. And we actually did an Australian webinar towards the end of last year, so focusing specifically on Australia, and we asked this same poll question, and actually the split of the results even back in November and focusing specifically on Australia were quite similar to this. So we had a number saying approved first time, but we also had a cohort saying that they needed 5 or more applications. Great. Well, thank you so much for participating in those poll questions. I have to say the polls are probably my favourite part of any webinar that we do. It's great to hear everyone's experiences and be able to share the results with you all. Now, moving on to our first location update. So we'll start off with Malaysia, and we will be focusing on West Malaysia. On 18 March 2020, Malaysia implemented a movement control order for the first time, abbreviated and known as MCO. Since that date, we've seen various extensions of the MCO, including even in this year, and at times an easing of restrictions. As a result of the MCO, processing by the immigration authorities was certainly impacted, and at times we saw very restricted services being offered by the immigration authorities, including daily quotas on how many people could attend the authorities and walk in the door, and even a cessation of services at one point where no applications were being processed or decided. For those of you who are familiar with the Malaysian immigration process, you would be aware that generally there are two key parts of the process. Firstly, we have the online application, which needs to be prepared and submitted. And then secondly, once that online application is approved, we have to submit the original passport for endorsement. Now, as of today, the authorities are processing online applications and approving those. However, in regards to arranging appointments for the endorsement of passports, an appointment must first be made with the authorities. So no walk-ins are allowed as part of the SOP, the standard operating procedure, throughout COVID. So an appointment must be made. Now, given the limited number of appointments on any one day, now the wait time for an appointment at the moment is actually about 2 months. So this is quite a significant lead time to arrange an appointment to attend the immigration authority and submit the passport over the counter to be endorsed. So there are some potential consequences because of this extended wait time for an appointment that we need to take into account. For new assignees who are arriving into the country, their entry visa may actually expire before their endorsement appointment. And for individuals who are currently in Malaysia and renewing their employment pass, their current pass may actually expire before their new pass is endorsed in their passport. So what this means is that a special pass may be required to regulate the individual's immigration status. Now, a special pass is a separate application and does involve additional costs. However, in positive news, it was announced last Friday, I believe, by the Immigration Department of Malaysia that they have introduced what's now called a e-special pass. So this e-special pass can actually be submitted through the Expatriate Service Division online portal as of the 15th of March. So previously with a special pass application, it was something that had to be applied for, usually at the time of the endorsement appointment. However, for employment pass renewals, which are processed through ESD online, it is now possible to submit an e-special pass online. Now, at this stage, this e-special pass only applies to employment pass renewal applications through ESD online, but we have been advised that this new e-special pass will extend to other passes at a later date. So, for example, professional visit passes, dependent passes, or long-term social visit passes. So we certainly welcome this development and hope that it will allow the immigration authorities to continue to achieve processing efficiencies. Now, as I mentioned earlier, processing times by the immigration authorities have been impacted as a result of the MCO. And as a result, we are seeing longer processing times at the moment for Malaysian passes. Prior to COVID, we were seeing online applications being finalised in approximately 5 to 7 working days, which is quite quick compared to some other locations in the region. However, now during COVID and the MCO, this processing time has been extended to approximately 3 weeks from the date of lodgement of the online application. And once the application has been approved, pass holders who are outside of Malaysia do not have an automatic right to enter the country. They must first obtain an entry approval from the Director General of Immigration. So that needs to be applied via the My Entry online system. Now, initially, when the entry approval process was introduced, these entry approval applications were submitted via email, and there was quite a long processing time and wait for a decision on those entry approvals. However, the government then transitioned to the My Entry online system, which has helped to streamline the process. In addition to obtaining entry approval, there are a few other steps that assignees need to undertake before they can travel to Malaysia. They need to pay for the quarantine costs up front. So the payment is to be made via the My Safe Travel website, and to confirm that does need to be arranged before the individual travels to Malaysia. And in fact, the proof of payment for the quarantine cost is required to download the entry approval letter. Assignees also need to complete and submit a letter of undertaking and indemnity, and submit that to the nearest Malaysian diplomatic mission, who will then issue what's called a notice of travel, and that notice of travel is required to be presented as part of the check-in process. Now, it is advised by the authorities that the letter of undertaking should be submitted at least 3 working days prior to travel. However, given the extension of processing times across the board, we would recommend submitting that letter of undertaking a bit more in advance than 3 working days. And then assignees must also download, activate and register their travel via the relevant app. So this needs to be done 1 day prior to the journey. Then, of course, once assignees have arrived in Malaysia, they need to undertake their mandatory quarantine. Initially, the mandatory quarantine period for Malaysia was 14 days, as we've seen in a majority of countries. However, late last year, the mandatory quarantine period was amended and it was reduced. So where a traveller enters Malaysia without having undertaken a COVID test prior to arrival, and they undertake the test upon arrival in Malaysia and of course achieve a negative result, the quarantine period is 10 days, so reduced from the initial 14-day period. However, if a traveller undertakes a COVID test within 3 days prior to departure and returns a negative result, and they then undertake another test upon arrival in Malaysia with another negative result, the quarantine period is reduced to 7 days. In terms of enhanced regulations, we did see the introduction of a labour market testing requirement for Malaysia after a few false starts during the second half of last year. So from the 1st of January this year, job vacancies must be advertised via the My Future Jobs portal for at least 30 days before submitting new employment pass applications, unless an exemption applies. Now, the objective of this requirement is to prioritise local employees in filling vacancies before allowing foreign workers to fill the position. Now, this wasn't unexpected given the rising levels of unemployment globally, and we also saw similar protectionist policies introduced back during the GFC. So it's not unexpected that such a requirement would be introduced to the Malaysian immigration process. Now, looking at all these factors, so the combination of potential delays in assignees being able to procure documents from various authorities, advertising the position if needed, processing delays from the authorities, obtaining an entry approval if you're outside of Malaysia, securing a flight, and then making sure that that flight actually takes off and isn't cancelled, undergoing quarantine, and then the wait time for an appointment to have the pass endorsed. This has resulted in the lead time for the Malaysian immigration process extending significantly. So if we're looking at the overall end-to-end process, so from initiation through to the pass being endorsed, we would generally recommend that you factor in approximately 4 to 6 months for the end-to-end process to be completed. So certainly recommend that you factor that in from a business perspective when you're undertaking your assignment planning. Next, we'll move on to China, focusing on Shanghai and Beijing. On the 28th of March 2020, China temporarily suspended entry into China by foreign nationals who were holding valid visas or residence permits. Entry by foreign nationals who were holding APEC business travel cards was also suspended. At the time, entry via a diplomatic, service, courtesy or C visa was not affected, however. Foreign nationals who were coming to China for necessary economic, trade, scientific or technological activities, or out of emergency humanitarian needs could still apply for visas at their closest Chinese embassy or consulate. And entry by foreign nationals with visas issued after the announcement were not affected. Now, whilst the Chinese authorities continue to process applications through the pandemic, there were some adjustments made in regards to the method of submission in some cases. So for example, in Beijing, for work permit, card renewals, cancellations, or legal entity changes, rather than continuing to require a counter submission, the process was changed to allow the relevant documents to be uploaded to the authority system online. And in Shanghai, we saw something similar. So rather than requiring face-to-face submission over the counter, work permit card renewals and cancellations could be facilitated via the online system. For those of you familiar with the Chinese immigration process, you'd be aware that there are a number of steps in the process, including obtaining an entry visa, undertaking a medical examination, obtaining the work permit, and then also obtaining the residence permit. So whilst we didn't see a significant increase in processing times from the local authorities over the last year, unlike some other locations, there are some additional steps in the process that need to be factored in when planning, and this includes obtaining a PU letter as part of the entry visa application process, and of course factoring in the mandatory quarantine period once the assignee arrives in China. So what a PU letter is essentially an invitation letter that is issued by the China Foreign Affairs Office. So when applying for an entry visa application through the local Chinese embassy or consulate, a PU letter is generally now one of the mandatory documents that is required. It's important to note that this PU letter will only be issued by the authorities where the assignee's trip is deemed essential to China. So essentially limiting the number of foreign arrivals in China throughout COVID. Now, in regards to obtaining a PU letter, it's not necessarily straightforward. In fact, some cities have temporarily suspended the issue of PU letters until further notice, meaning that assignees can therefore not apply for their entry visa where that's required. The Beijing Foreign Affairs Office has temporarily suspended the issue of PU letters since the end of January this year, and the Shanghai Foreign Affairs Office in certain districts has also temporarily suspended the issue of PU letters. So we have been advised that in Beijing, the position on PU letters may change towards the end of this month and they may recommence being issued. However, we will let you know as soon as there are any updates in regards to that. It was announced, however, on the 15th of March, so only earlier this week, that foreign nationals may be able to apply for an entry visa in some countries without a PU letter if they have received a Chinese-made COVID vaccine. We've also seen an easing of restrictions for those foreign nationals who are holding valid Chinese residence permits for work, personal matters or reunion. So as of the 28th of September last year, those foreign nationals holding a valid Chinese residence permit for those three purposes that I mentioned, work, personal matters or reunion, can in fact enter China without a new entry visa. Please note, however, that there are some restrictions on this. So this does not apply for travellers from the UK, France, Belgium, India, the Philippines, Bangladesh or Russia, who are considered to be in high-risk COVID locations. In addition, anyone whose residence permit in one of those three categories that I mentioned expired after the 28th of March 2020 may apply via their closest Chinese embassy or consulate for a new entry visa to re-enter China. In regards to quarantine, it's important to note that there is no standard requirement. It does vary according to the location. For example, in Beijing, there are three parts to the quarantine. So firstly, we have 14 days of hotel quarantine, followed by another 7 days of home quarantine, and then 7 days of health monitoring. Now, during this health monitoring period, individuals cannot attend public gatherings or join in group activities. In Shanghai, however, travellers can complete 7 days of hotel quarantine, followed by 7 days of home quarantine, provided that certain conditions are met. So for example, for the home quarantine, an individual's home or apartment needs to have an individual entrance and an individual air conditioner. In terms of enhanced regulations, whilst we have seen other countries introduce tighter criteria for the assessment of work permits, including labour market testing, this has not occurred at this stage in China. I'll now hand it over to Janea, who will update you on Australia. Thanks, Janea.
Thanks, Maria. Firstly, I'm going to start with a high-level overview of Australia's border closure timeline. So in March 2020, a human biosecurity emergency was declared in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in the closing of our borders to any non-citizens and non-permanent residents from 9 p.m. on the 19th of March. The only temporary visa holders who are exempt from this ban were immediate family members of Australian citizens and permanent residents, as well as New Zealand citizens ordinarily resident in Australia. Since then, the Australian Border Force has been given powers to approve inwards travel exemptions to temporary visa holders on a case-by-case basis, and the Health Minister has banned Australians from travelling offshore unless granted a travel exemption first. Today, the travel bans still remain in place, with the outwards travel ban to continue until 17th of March this year, unless further extended, while the inwards travel ban as it applies to temporary visa holders has no end date in sight. However, there are positive signs that the travel bubbles between Australia and other low-risk countries in the region may develop in the future. Presently, we have a semi-travel bubble with New Zealand, whereby certain residents within that country are able to travel to Australia with an automatic exemption and without needing to quarantine on arrival. So the question we often get asked by clients is, how has the travel ban impacted on visa processing? Suffice to say, processing times for Australia visa applications has been significantly impacted on due to the pandemic and the associated travel bans. If the applicant is offshore, they must apply for and be granted a visa application by the Department of Home Affairs and request and receive a travel exemption from the Australian Border Force before they can travel to Australia. However, most offshore applications will be put on hold or deferred until a travel exemption is in effect. If a travel exemption is granted, then the associated visa application will generally be finalised within 1 week, we're finding, if it's decision ready. However, if the travel exemption is not granted, processing times may be longer than the service standard outlined on the Department of Home Affairs website, particularly if the bans persist. So what are the travel exemptions? In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of the categories, but generally we are seeking exemptions for workers with critical skills required to maintain the supply of essential goods and services in Australia, such as critical infrastructure, engineering and mining, and food production, to name a few. Also, workers delivering services in sectors that are critical to Australia's economic recovery, such as financial technology, media and television production, large-scale manufacturing, and emerging technology. And that includes things like AI, data science, and cybersecurity. In September last year, the Australian government introduced a priority migration skilled occupation list, or PMSOL, which contains 18 occupations that are considered to be critical for the recovery of Australia's economy. While the majority of occupations relate to healthcare, there are other occupations such as CEO, construction project manager, mechanical engineer, software engineer, and developer programmer that can be relied upon for the exemption. The occupations on the PMSOL list are also subject to priority processing under the employer-sponsored programs, includes both temporary and permanent. So in some cases, we are seeing the visa application finalised quite quickly, even before the travel exemption has been granted. Just a quick tip, if you are seeking to apply for a travel exemption, we recommend that you submit as much objective and verifiable evidence as possible. So support letters from private organisations such as clients or suppliers, or letters from state or territory government, including your local MP, will be given considerable weight, in addition to any supporting evidence provided by the sponsor. So once the visa is approved and the travel exemption is in place, the next hurdle is to secure flights into Australia and pass through quarantine on arrival. Presently, our clients are finding that obtaining the travel exemption and visa approval is half the battle in getting to Australia. Whilst we have increased the number of arrivals in certain states, there is still limited flight availability into Australia. In some cases, we've had clients charter flights in order to bring in larger volumes of skilled workers rather than rely on commercial flights. Since January this year, new arrivals who are travelling into Australia must provide evidence of a negative COVID-19 PCR test to their airline and complete an online travel statement prior to boarding the flight, usually with 72 hours lead into that flight. In addition, travellers must wear a mask on all international flights, including within the airports. Once in Australia, visitors are required to complete 14 days hotel quarantine as directed by the airport staff, unless they arrive on a quarantine-free flight from New Zealand, or they have approval to home quarantine, which is generally granted on health grounds. The last two topics on the slide relate to enhanced regulations and opening up of new visa pathways in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who are not familiar with Australia's work visa programs, the temporary skilled shortage, subclass 482, is an employer-sponsored visa which is mainly used by businesses to fill skill shortages. It's applied for in 3 stages, the first stage being sponsorship application, the second stage being nomination application, which relates to the position to be filled, and the third step is the visa application, which is submitted by the prospective employee. The labour market testing requirement, which forms part of the nomination application or second step, requires businesses to provide evidence that they cannot source a suitably qualified or experienced Australian worker to fill a nominated position. As of 1 October last year, labour market testing must include an advertisement on the Australian government's Job Outlook website, along with 2 other advertisements, so it's Job Active website, along with 2 other advertisements on a national recruitment website, print media or radio. All 3 adverts must be posted within 28 days in the 4 months prior to application lodgement. The introduction of Job Active as an additional advertisement advertising requirement is in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which unfortunately has resulted in many workers being stood down, retrenched or made redundant. Rightly so, this amendment is meant to ensure that Australian workers are being prioritised for job opportunities in Australia. An exemption to advertising is available if it would be inconsistent with Australia's international trade obligations or if alternative arrangements apply. Commonly, businesses are able to access alternative arrangements for intra-corporate transfer arrangements or where the nominee's earnings exceed $250,000 per annum. To round out the Australian presentation, I just wanted to flag two visa options which are gaining interests from businesses in Australia. They include the new COVID-19 pandemic stream subclass 408, which may suit some workers who are, one, coming up to expiry, two, have no other visa options in which to depart, and three, who cannot depart within 28 days of that expiry. The visa permits critical work in critical sectors. However, most applicants will only be granted this visa for a short period of time, in some cases only 2 months. However, that 2 months could in theory be used to bridge the gap between that and another work visa, potentially a subclass 482. There's also been increased public interest in the global talent visa in recent times, which is aimed towards attracting internationally recognised candidates in the arts, sports, academia and business, with particular focus on 10 industry sectors, including resources, agri-food and ag tech, energy, health industries, defence, advanced manufacturing and space, circular economy, digitech, infrastructure and tourism, financial services and fintech, and education. The new sectors were mapped out by the federal government in December last year and quietly added to the Home Affairs website last month. Presently, we're seeing priority processing of these applications, with some applications processed within 1 to 2 months, including for offshore applicants. This now concludes the Australian immigration portion of the presentation. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Mars Omar, who will provide an overview of the latest immigration policies and requirements in Singapore. So over to you, Mars.
Thank you, Jana. Hello, everybody. There's been a lot of changes in Singapore since COVID-19 comes to our life. And previously in phase 2, Singapore Ministry of Manpower, or MOM, has rejected all applications where candidates are currently not in Singapore. So for now, we have seen MOM accepting new work pass like employment pass, S pass, as long as the candidates or applicants meets the MOM criteria and the candidate eligibility. But of course, the work pass approval is subjected to the discretion of MOM officer who is assessing each of the applications. Yeah, so typically MOM will take up to 3 weeks to process work pass applications. So MOM will assess each application holistically based on candidates' educations, work pass experience, job title, monthly salary, and both company and candidates' overall profile. It may take longer if MOM officer who assessing the application requires more time to assess or needs third-party vendor to verify the applicant's profile. This may up to take 8 weeks or more for MOM to update on the application outcome. For example, if the candidates or the applicants of your employee has been a Singaporean permanent resident or Singaporeans before, in this case, MOM will need to check with the Singapore Immigration Department. So it will take some time. So based on our observation as well, certain nationality may need more time to process candidates or applications from Indonesia or other parts of the world, certain countries like Russia. And if the company has a record with the MOM for certain reasons, it may take up to 3 months for MOM to process new work pass application. Yeah. So although Singapore is opening up slowly on their travel bubble, all pass holders, which means work passes and dependents, will still need and require permission to enter Singapore. So due to high COVID situation, travelers departing UK or South Africa at this moment who are spending in the last 14 days are not allowed to enter Singapore if they're coming from these two countries. So definitely, if you are departing from UK or South Africa for the last 14 days, you are not allowed to even to apply for pre-entry approval to enter Singapore. Yeah. So as per last Monday, 15 March at 9 a.m., employers or companies may apply for pre-entry application for the employers under Safe Travel Portal. So this is a new portal introduced by the SHN, which informs submitter on the spot if on the planned arrival dates are available for the travelers to enter Singapore. So hence, once you found an available entry date, fill up the required details and make full payment online, as you will need to pay upfront Make sure your pass holder's arrival date and travel itinerary are confirmed before you apply on their entry visa or at pre-entry approval. Approval will be granted instantly, so you will not on the spot, not like previously last week where you have to wait for MOM outcome, which may take more than a day or 3 days over the weekends. Okay, for example, returning from India can be challenging recently, and you may have not been successful in your pre-entry applications. So in this new platform, you can check if the arrival dates departing from India were available, and the pass holders can enter Singapore on that day and apply accordingly. Yeah. So however, if you're for S pass and work permit under construction, marine shipyard, and process sectors, so if you are under this company, they will still need to apply for pre-entry approval under Ministry of Manpower. So unless you are non-construction, marine, shipyard, and process sectors, you can apply pre-entry approval under the Safe Travel. Okay, so in general, 40 days of quarantine is required upon arrival in Singapore. So in Singapore, quarantine means they will refers to short home notice, stay home notice, sorry, which is SHN. The SHN period or requirement will vary according to the assignees or travelers' history in the last 14 days before they arrive Singapore. For example, travelers departing from the last 14 days from Brunei Darussalam, mainland China, Australia, Taiwan, and New Zealand do not need to quarantine or SHN. They will need to go for quarantine PCR test upon arrival with self-sourced accommodation or their own residence until test results are released to them. Normally for this COVID-19 test, for them, the results will be out within 48 to 12 hours. So you will know on the same day whether you're negative or you're positive. So if you are negative, then you can just go out if you are coming from these countries. Yeah. So travelers from the last 14 days from Fiji, Hong Kong, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Vietnam may opt out for Singapore dedicated facilities, which is SDF, by the Singapore government and organized by the SHN team, and serve the entire duration of SHN at their residence, or provided they follow the criteria set by the SHN team. So they may opt to actually stay at their own residence or at SDF. So it depends on them if you are coming from these countries. So with regards to the rest of the other countries, you will need to serve 14 days SHN at Singapore dedicated facilities, SDF. Yeah, so with regards to the COVID-19 tests, all incoming travelers required to take COVID-19 tests except for children who are below 6 years old. So unless you are not 6 years old on this year, you need to take for COVID-19 tests upon arrival. And unless you depart from countries who does not need SHN, like Australia, Brunei Darussalam, travelers from most countries will need to have COVID-19 PCR test within 72 hours before departure for Singapore and obtain a valid negative test results. So if your travelers are diagnosed with positive before they arrive Singapore and pre-entry approval has been approved, they can only enter Singapore and after 21 days and ensure that the test result is negative for the second one. Yeah, and the travelers will still need to have COVID-19 test on arrival in Singapore and another COVID-19 test at the end of the SHN. So for those travelers who have tested positive COVID-19 before arriving Singapore, instead of taking COVID-19 test, they will have to take a serology blood test. So this is to ensure whether the antibiotics on the test of your COVID-19, how strong is your body. Okay, recently the SHN team has also introduced SHN suites. So hence for those travelers who needs to stay at SDF, which is by the Singapore government hotels, they may book and upgrade their stay at SDF at a suite at a higher cost. So they may book a suite booking after they have obtained a pre-entry approval. So the cost of this suite is actually about, the minimum is about 6,000 per person for single occupancy, and additional cost of 600 for every person, age 4 and above. So if you have a kid of a 3 years old and needs food for during the SDF or during the suite stay, you need to pay an additional of $600. Yeah. So in terms of enhanced regulations, so what have MOM recent changes? So from 23rd December 2020, which is last year, all pass holders are required to update MOM on their residential address or mobile number within 5 days of any changes. So in this case, employers or companies will need to inform or remind their work pass holders on the district regulations. So due to COVID-19, they need to update correctly in the MOM portal. So the update can be done by the employers and the employees via the MOM platform using CodePass or SingPass. So penalties for non-compliance may include revocations of work passes. So you need to remind your employees or pass holders on this. Yeah. So, and another change is from September, October last year, 2020, MOM has also had introduced employers will need to advertise job advertisement for new S-Pass application. Similarly, like new EP application, the job advertise will need to be run for 28 days. So prior to this, the job advertisement only applies for EP holders and will need to run for 30 days. So EP and S-Pass holders, you need to actually advertise for new applications and the job advertisement need to run for 28 days. And from September 2020, the minimum qualifying salary for an EP has been raised to 4,500 for new applications. And for December last year, 2020, the minimum qualifying salary for EP candidates in the financial sector will be raised to 5,000 for new applications. You can check whether you're in the financial sectors in the MOM websites. Definitely like banks and will be considered as financial service sectors. And the qualifying salaries for older and more experienced candidates in their 40s will be raised correspondingly and will remain around double the minimum qualifying salary for the youngest applicants. So the new salary criteria will also apply to those renewing their EPs if their passes are expiring from 1st of May 2021. So we will recommend that employers or companies to renew their passes, their EP passes 6 months before expiry of the employees' work passes to ensure that work pass holders are still eligible for an EP pass. So you need to make sure that the salaries and the job title and working experience are within the categories set by MOM. Okay, for other informations, so for S-Pass holders who are returning to Singapore, employers must purchase medical insurance with a coverage of at least $10,000. So all other pass holders, example, EP pass holders or their dependents, are encouraged to buy medical insurance with the appropriate coverage before entering Singapore. So if your employee is diagnosed positive from COVID-19, the employer will be charged of hospitalizations bills and you may claim it from your insurance. So in this case, we have an example before where an employee was diagnosed with positive COVID-19 test twice and he has been hospitalized. So the hospitalization bill will be sent to the employee. Yeah, only the hospitalization bill, and you can claim it via your insurance. I see. And another big, I would say, change recently will be the letter of consent, which is actually for consistency with the updates MOM has made to their work pass framework. MOM will be aligning the requirements for DP holders who wish to work in Singapore with the requirements for all employers, for all other foreign workers in Singapore. So DP holders who's actually, from 1st May 2021, all DP holders who wish to be employed will need to apply for applicable work pass such as employment pass, S pass, work permit instead of letter of consent, LOC. Currently, a dependent pass of a work pass holder may work under the letter of consent once it's approved for MOM. So existing DP LOC holders can continue to work until the expiry of the LOC. So for example, if the LOC is expiring on 1st of August 2023, the LOC holder can work to this validity date. So employers can actually check again the validity of the LOC and make sure that if the LOC is expiring soon, you can actually apply, ensure that the EP is renewed first before 1st May and get the LOC approved first, or alternatively apply for the EP pass or S pass for these LOC pass holders. Yeah, so that's about all for Singapore at this moment. So thank you. I now hand over to my colleague Carmen, who will update you on Hong Kong.
Thank you, Mars. Hi, everyone. Due to COVID, the Hong Kong Immigration Department has at times over the last year been completely closed, only providing urgent services to the public. However, in positive news, they are now resumed full operations as of 18th of February this year. All visa applications are now accepted for processing. However, we would expect some processing delays due to various factors, including backlog of applications and reduced manpower. Whilst there's no confirmed timeline for processing delays, based on our experience, we estimate this is going to be around additional 2 weeks' time. In terms of processing renewal application, the department has implemented 2 new measures during COVID. Prior to COVID, the department was allowing applicants to submit renewal applications 3 months in advance of expiry date, thus providing sufficient time for the renewal to be processed prior to the expiry date. However, during COVID, the Immigration Department has reduced this window and is now only accepting renewal submissions within 1 month prior to the visa expiry. So with the current processing time being approximately 46 weeks from the day of lodgement, there are instances where the renewal application may therefore not be able to finalize before the visa expiry date. Where this happens, the assignee will need to cease work until the renewal has been approved and ensure full immigration compliance are met. The second measure that was introduced in regards to visa renewal is more positive. In the past, applicants were required to physically present in Hong Kong for both at the time of application and submission and collection of the visa. However, due to COVID, some visa holders have been unable to return to Hong Kong, but they are allowed to apply for the visa extension while prior to the visa expiry. For those who are going to expire within 1 month's time or had already expired, but is less than 12 months, they are able to submit the application through Hong Kong with the supporting documents and also the letter stating that why they're unable to return to Hong Kong. If the application is successful, the immigration will grant the visa for them. That is going to be an entry visa to allow the applicant to enter Hong Kong within 6 months' time. If in the event that the visa has been extended and the assignee is unable to return to Hong Kong within the specified timeline, the immigration will not further grant the further extension to them. So which means if they cannot return to Hong Kong within the specified timeline, they will need to apply for a fresh application. A fresh application will process about 4 to 6 weeks time from the day of submission, provided all requirements are met. And if a new application is required, the business may also require to provide justification of hiring a foreigner and explain why the applicant is required to return to Hong Kong for employment. Such justification will need to include information on why the position cannot be filled in Hong Kong locally and why is it essential for the applicant to be based in Hong Kong. So the assessment will actually based on the documents provided, and the final decision will rest with the Immigration Department. Can approved visa holder enter the country? Approved visa can actually enter Hong Kong without any separate travel approval, which differs to a number of locations we have discussed earlier. The only exception is travelers who have spent more than 2 hours in the past 21 days in any of the following locations, which we are referring to UK, South Africa, Brazil, and Ireland, All persons who have stayed in these specified extreme high-risk places for more than 2 hours in the last 21 days will not be allowed to board for flight to Hong Kong, even they have visas. In terms of quarantine arrangement, all persons arriving at the Hong Kong airport or land boundary controls point who have stayed in the places outside of China in the last 21 days have to undergo compulsory quarantine for 21 days in the designated quarantine hotels. One thing to point out is the required quarantine period in Hong Kong. For some locations that you have seen, the required quarantine period is 14 days or less in some cases. However, in Hong Kong, the required quarantine period is in fact 21 days. Please note there are enhanced entry requirements for travelers arriving from high-risk places, such as UK, South Africa, Brazil, and Ireland, where the individual is allowed to board the flight on the basis that they have spent less than 2 hours in the past 21 days in that location. As mentioned earlier, travelers who have spent more than 2 hours in the past 21 days in the UK, South Africa, Brazil, and Ireland will not be allowed to board the flight to Hong Kong, even if their visa has been approved. As the requirement of high-risk location will change from time to time, it is advisable to reconfirm the requirements before making any arrangements or bookings. To further prevent importation of COVID cases and reduce contact between returnees from overseas and to the local community, the government has fully implemented the designated quarantine hotel scheme on the 22nd of December last year. All travelers arriving from countries outside of China are required to undergo compulsory quarantine for 21 days at designated hotel. Given the ongoing COVID developments, the government fully implemented the designated hotel scheme on the 22nd of December last year. An additional 36 designated quarantine hotels were introduced in the second cycle, providing about 10,000 rooms. Designated quarantine hotels are required to observe the following strict requirements, which includes all destination hotel has to be inspected by the relevant government department, so they can ensure that the design, facility, and operations of the hotels meet the requirements. Designated hotels should not accept any non-quarantine guests during the period. Public should also not allowed to have access to the hotel premises, except for the areas in the lobby car park, which has been properly segregated. Hotels should take all reasonable procedure to ensure that persons undergoing quarantine will not leave their rooms during the quarantine period, and no visitations to these persons should be allowed. Hotels should also step up cleansing and infection control, as well as security arrangement for these relevant staff to attend COVID tests where required. To minimize the contact between travelers and to the communication, the government has provided designated point-to-point transportation at the airport to transfer travelers to the designated quarantine hotels. In terms of enhanced regulation, as discussed by my colleagues earlier in the presentation, we are seeing enhanced labor marketing testing requirements other than protection policies being implemented in a number of locations. In Hong Kong, whilst there isn't a strict requirement to advertise the position, the Immigration Department has the discretion to request justification for hiring a foreigner as part of their assessment. As such, employers should be prepared to provide a strong business case to why a foreign worker has been selected to fill the position, as mentioned earlier. Sirva would also recommend submitting this justification to upfront to avoid any potential processing delays. That's all for the Hong Kong update, and I will now head back to Maria and to open up the session for Q&A.
Thanks, Carmen. Before we answer some of the questions that were sent through via the Q&A, I did just want to share one of the comments that was sent through. So in regards to the entry approval process, we had one attendee send through a note saying that their record is 40 times in Singapore. So they had to apply 40 times to obtain an entry approval to enter Singapore. So that's probably the most number of times I've come across over the last 12 months, but just wanted to share that with you as an example. In regards to some of the questions that we received, so in regards to Malaysia, a popular question was in regards to the job advertisement requirement that is in effect as of the 1st of January. So the question was around what pass types that requirement applies to. So at this stage, it does only apply to new employment pass applications. It doesn't apply to other pass types, such as a professional visit pass or a residence talent pass. That is, of course, subject to change in the future, but at this stage it is for new employment pass applications only. And as I mentioned, there are some exemptions that are available. For example, and this is not a definitive list, but if the application is for the renewal of an employment pass, then that is an automatic exemption from the job advertisement requirement. There is also an exemption for certain key positions, which includes C-suite executives or assignees who are earning a basic monthly salary of at least 15,000 ringgit and higher. In regards to China, the most common question we have received is in regards to when can the assignee actually start work in China. So as I mentioned, there are multiple steps in the Chinese immigration process, which does include a work permit application and a residence permit application. To be able to start work in China legally, the assignee does need to have both the work permit and the residence permit in hand. So firstly, the work permit is submitted and obtained, and then the residence permit. So assignees do need to have that residence permit to be able to legally start working in China. Now, Janaea, over to you in regards to the questions that we received for Australia. So one of the questions that we received was in regards to labour market testing. So this seems to be a popular theme today, and the question was in regards to whether or not LinkedIn is an acceptable method for labour market testing.
And the quick answer is yes. So the online recruitment platform is fine, providing the advertisements are not restricted to the LinkedIn profile members. It's also acceptable, which wasn't mentioned, on if the sponsor is accredited, so on their careers external website also counts. However, it doesn't include the website of an associated entity, for example. I also noticed there was another question that came through, and it was around when is there a chance of the border opening for Australia, but unfortunately there's no definitive answer or definitive date that Australia will open its borders, though we expect that we'll probably see some travel bubbles pop up before they actually, the borders do open up in full. There are some discussions around Singapore and Australia having a travel bubble, which hopefully, fingers crossed, occurs sometime in July, but that's in preliminary talks at the moment.
Great, thanks, Janaea. Mars, in regards to Singapore, so one of the questions that we received was in regards to the entry approval process and the upfront payment that's now required. Are you able to clarify what it is that needs to be paid upfront? Is it the quarantine costs?
Thanks, Maria. Okay, for the new quarantine, it will be the quarantine cost of $2,000 per room per application, and the COVID-19 test of 125 after the 14 days SHN, and also the 160 upon arrival, the COVID-19 upon arrival at the Changi Airport. Yeah. And Maria, there's another question which is actually under the question and answer by Priyanka Soni. The questions will be, hello, when you mentioned that the new EP requirement for candidates above 40 is double the EP requirement salary, does that mean the minimum for an EP application who is more experienced will be around 10K Singapore dollars and above. Is this mandatory or subject to the discretion of MOM officer? So MOM officer will actually assess each applicant application individually and holistically, as I mentioned before, based on candidates' education, working experience, job title, monthly salary, and the company's candidates, overall profiles. So the assessment is still subjected to discretion of the MO officer. So although above 40, if you are above, if your salary above 10K and above, is still subjected to the discretion of MOM officer. So they may find that, for example, individual candidates earning 10K, but with an experience of 20 years of experience in the industry. So MOM officer may find it that he should earn more than 10K. So it's still subjected to discretion of MOM officer in this case. And another thing, just now you see about the pool, about the 40 times of getting pre-entry approval. I guess whoever the person is, and everybody will be happy on the Safe Travel portal now, where you can get the answers on the spot. Yeah, so that's all for now. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks, Mars. And Carmen, over to you. So one of the questions that we received was in regards to applying for a renewal of an employment visa where the assignee is outside of China. So that was one of the new developments that you touched on. Can you talk to us a bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. The immigration actually has provided more flexibility during this time to allow people who are unable to return to Hong Kong due to travel restrictions or travel bans to return to submit their renewal application. So they have implemented this measure to allow the applicants to be able to send their application to Hong Kong for submission without the need of sending the original passport and without the need being present in Hong Kong. So this processing time actually will take up to 4 weeks time, but provided all the employment requirements or all the employment's previous arrangement remain unchanged, immigration will consider granting the visa application to them. And this is going to be an entry visa, meaning that the original visa label will be sent to the respective assignees or applicant, and they will need to carry that visa label to enter Hong Kong to activate the visa on arrival. Having said that, the activation, meaning that the extension will be actually continuous, granted from the previous visa expiry, and it will last for the period of time up to the maximum periods of 3 years. Now, having said that, this is a one-off visa extension, and this will allow the applicant to return to Hong Kong within 6 months' time. If in the event that the applicant is unable to return to Hong Kong within the 6 months period, then a fresh application will need to be submitted. Otherwise, so basically they will have to plan ahead before to make sure that they will be able to enter during this time to activate the visa. Having said that, this is just the current temporary implementation measure. This will actually change from time to time. So it will be best to check with us or before we actually physically submit the application to ensure that the measure is still in place and we can still process the application. Yep. That's all. Over to you, Maria.
Thanks, Carmen. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the session. If you do have any additional questions or need immigration assistance, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. Our contact details are on the screen. So thank you once again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.